We're being joined now by a 39-year veteran of the Los Angeles Police Department. He grew up in various parts of the United States. He joined the LAPD in 1981, rose through the ranks, and he's now the chief of our department. Chief Michel Moore, welcome to the front page.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm blessed. How are you?
I am blessed as well. Thank you.
I know that you wanted to come on and talk about what we're seeing in Minnesota, specifically around the trial of Derek Chauvin, where you had one of your officers actually take the stand. Of course, we have lots going on the ground here in LA as well. But tell me why that case is so important to you.
Well, I think it's important to America and it's important to the world. The graphic and disturbing images that we saw last year that resulted in the death of George Floyd. A year ago, I remember watching the first time I watched the video and just could not understand this officer's actions, his lack of humanity, it's just apparent lack of any regard for a man pleading. And it was just so, it was hurting. It hurt. It was disturbing. And we recognize in the aftermath of that death, the civil unrest, the protests, the expressions that came from those was our community hurting. And so a year later, we now see this trial and those images are brought back before us. We hear the testimony of the medical experts. We see our own sergeant that went there to testify how that use of force was without any justification and not reflective of what LAPD or for that matter what law enforcement trains its personnel to do. And I felt the pain again, and I felt that. And then so people started asking me as a chief, well, what are you doing to get ready for demonstrations and protests and in the aftermath of this trial? And I spoke with faith leaders, and I spoke with community advocates and others, and everyone kept asking, so what's the police response? How many officers are you going to have, and what are those officers going to do, and are you going to call the National Guard? And I just this past Monday, I felt it was necessary, and I invited a series of faith leaders and those same community activists to a press conference to say that the LAPD response is first and foremost to recognize the pain and the suffering and the anger, the frustration of having seen this incident happen, that the murder of George Floyd was just such a grievous act, and that we expect and fully recognize the need for members of our public, particularly the African American community, to express themselves and to be heard, and for their voices to be heard, and how intolerable this is, and also how reflective and how this seems to reflect this systemic issue that we have in American policing from time to time. And I am an absolute advocate to call out and identify the progress that's been made here in Los Angeles, but yet I know we have so much farther to go. But at this moment, I felt it was more appropriate, and I think it's more appropriate now to talk about the fact that we recognize that this pain that this man caused and how that reflects upon our badge. And we want to just stress that expression we believe is needed. And at the same time, to ask everyone to work together, and as we express that we not allow individuals to try to capitalize on this and somehow hijack it and do acts of violence or acts of violence in our community, that violence not take away their voices,
right.
Because everyone, and that's what's key. So I wanted to change the conversation to what really should happen today, which is just to recognize this grievous act and to validate the fact of how people are feeling about this. And as a police chief of Los Angeles, to say that we want to see and will facilitate those First Amendment rights of everyone to for this moment to not pass.
Okay, well, there's a lot of stuff to unpack there. First of all, I think a lot of people were feeling good watching the trial because it's rare where we see officers, particularly a chief of police in this case from Minneapolis, on agreeing that this isn't right. And we've seen that in the year since, a little less than a year since this happened, that law enforcement have said, well, this isn't right. This is beyond the pale. But the thing that's hard about that for me is I feel like this is a rare case, and yet for us on the ground, we see cases all the time that seem like we should have the same response from law enforcement. You know, the question is always, where are the good cops? Why don't more... Brendan Glenn is an example. Why don't we have more follow-up? Why don't we have more of these conversations? It's not just George Floyd, I guess, is the point.
I think you're right. The challenge for us, and one of the things that I'd like to see in further reform here in California, is that actions of police departments, particularly actions of police departments regarding discipline of officers, be more transparent. Last year, we had 17 officers that were fired because of misconduct and because of wrongdoings. And it wasn't, and we've also had firings of officers for out of policy shootings. And as we move forward, oftentimes we're actually prohibited by state law to talk about discipline in so many instances. And I think that the public there's a disservice to officers and the public, and certainly to good departments that have discipline and recognize that when officers commit misconduct and act egregiously. Now, as far as prosecution, criminal prosecutions of officers, we are seeing that, I believe, today, instances in which gross violations and where officers act recklessly, that there are efforts to criminally prosecute them and hold them accountable. And simultaneously, officers also have very, very tough and difficult jobs. And I know how deeply disturbing it is when you see a young man who is running from the police. He's armed with a handgun. He may turn on the officer, and now an officer-involved shooting happens, and that man's decision and the officer defending himself results in that man's death.
But it's not, a lot of times they're not armed with a handgun. They're running away and they're shot in the back. Right. I mean, we see this over and over again, Chief Moore, and it is disturbing. And the thing that makes it even more disturbing is it doesn't happen in Beverly Hills. It doesn't happen on the West Side. People have this. I shouldn't say Beverly Hills because it's a different police department, but West LA. And it's the same training, but it doesn't result in deadly force. I mean, everyone talks about Dylan Roof as the perfect example. They take him to Burger King, whereas Dante Wright gets shot over whatever it is, expired tags. And
as we speak about police use of force and use of deadly force, I can speak from a position of Los Angeles, where last year,
of course,
with 27 officer-involved shootings. The second lowest number in more than 30 years. When we look back 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, our numbers were over 100 officer-involved shootings. But yet I also recognize I'm speaking on behalf of law enforcement across the country. 17,000 agencies, 750,000 officers. Most agencies, much like we saw with Brooklyn Center, have 50 officers or less. And yet when they have an officer, like we saw this just terrible imagery of an officer who shoots an unarmed black young man as he's attempting to flee, and shoots him, and then identifies that she thought it was a taser. That reflects on everyone who wears the badge, and it doesn't reflect well. I mean, we have specific and extensive training. We do more than 50% higher levels of training for our officers than California requires, and in many parts of the country, that's not even what California requires. Is not even the standard. I've spoken with police chiefs that hire police officers off the street as if they're hiring someone to work a fast food stand. And there's nothing against fast food workers, but certainly they should not be positioned with handguns and charged to make split-second decisions and exercise the type of restraint that we expect American policing to. So I speak on a couple of different hats today. This morning as chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, but also I know that the anguish of this, it extends across when we see images from across the country. But if I pull it back to Los Angeles, what I ask Angelenos to do is look locally and look at our efforts here. And we do have officer-involved shootings that are controversial, and yet we also hold. I as chief and my predecessors have held officers who've shot unarmed individuals accountable by firing those individuals. And or seeking them to be fired. That's not always successful with matters that are beyond my control as far as appeal processes and so forth. But we had just a tragic shooting in Hollywood at a LA Fitness a couple of years ago, and that individual, that officer's actions I found to be out of policy was vocal in my rejection of his supposed defense, and recommended that he be removed. And those are the types of instances that I believe we have to also, though, look at and say, well, we just can't fire or we just can't remove the officers that make those mistakes, because the mistake can't be undone. We have to look at what is our training, how are we selecting people, how are we managing their capabilities, their attitudes, and how are we ensuring that their preservation, that their reverence for life is a guiding principle. And when we see lesser levels of force, that we don't see that being held, then we've got to make sure that we stop those also, because the actual use of deadly force, still a rarity, if you will, too many, but still the vast minority of interactions where force is used. How do we ensure that those lesser levels are also reflective of the fact that we're going to de-escalate, we're going to use force as a last resort, and yet at the same time, we recognize that officers are in dangerous and perilous conditions at times, and they are called upon to make arrests and to defend themselves. And I have to be able to defend, and I will defend on officers' ability to defend himself or herself from an imminent risk of death or serious bodily injury. But that decision is the most critical decision that person will ever make, and it also will have to withstand the highest level of scrutiny, and that, and at times that comes down where the officer's actions were wrong.
Right. So the LA Police Commission ruled Tuesday that the police officers that shot Daniel Hernandez Bravo were justified. We see this again and again, but does that mean we need to change and I'm not just putting it on the police commission, because it happens again and again on every level. Do we need to change? Do we need to get rid of the Police Officers Bill of Rights or adjust it? Do you support the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act? Do we need to restructure the way our city deals with discipline? Because from the ground level, and we have seen a spate of shootings actually in the past, 10 days or so. What do we have to do locally to change?
So what I would like the public to do is that beginning almost 3 years ago, we began publishing videos and showing what the body-worn video, what the camera testimony has, as well as the officer's initial account on officer-involved shootings. And you recognize that just recently we had a spat of officer-involved shootings, in close proximity to one another, and one of them involved a SWAT officer that was shot. By the grace of God, was not killed. And then the gunman comes out and armed with a shotgun, and another officer-involved shooting happens, and he loses his life. Now, in that instance, we'll look and wait until all the evidence is in. But in that instance where an officer is nearly killed, and the assault of the suspect continues, it is the unfortunate reality that we live in such a violent society in which people are willing to use weapons and willing to shoot others as they go about for their own purposes. We've seen shooting violence in Los Angeles increase at an enormous level, levels we haven't seen in more than a decade, and that includes the loss of life at a level also that we've not seen in more than a decade. So gun violence continues to be too high. It's one of America's greatest threats to its safety and its democracy, and police violence associated with that, and officers defending themselves. And people will often look at police violence and say this is excessive and it's wrong. And there are times in which it is, but there's also times in which an officer is coming to his or her own defense, and in doing so, they must be able to rely on deadly force. So I think that we have to look at each individual instance. We have to look at all the evidence. We have to allow for the fact that officers will come into situations in which their ability to defend themselves it must be maintained. Now, you asked for what other changes. There are changes that can occur. There's also been changes that have already occurred. LAPD, under the Commission's leadership, has continued to change and restrict and further narrow the use of deadly force. And we've seen both the policy as well as our training and our accountability lessen the number of times in which officers have resorted to force. And we've also seen instances where officers have violated that policy and consequences from it. So I think that those are in place. As to the George Floyd criminal justice reform, many aspects of that I and other major city chiefs across the country support, and rank and file. And many of the aspects within that bill, LAPD and the state of California have already implemented. And so when we look at American policing, it's not an even landscape. There are requirements and restrictions and expectations of policing here in Los Angeles, I believe, is very representative of 21st century policing. We don't always get it right, and our people, there are instances in which they fall short, but we remain on the leading edge of reforms, and we're committed to further reforms, particularly in an area of transparency. I believe that the more the public understands what happens and what the actions of the officers are and what the consequences for those are, I think the more that we could improve the public's trust of policing.
So that's a yes on George Floyd, on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act.
It's a yes. It's a yes. I believe the challenge, that the sticky point regarding George Floyd is how qualified immunity is defined, and I believe in working with major city chiefs, we're putting out a policy statement or a position statement on that very soon. And it goes to this. It goes to that there have been excesses. There have been examples where qualified immunity has allowed an officer to escape any type of liability for civil liability, not criminal liability. This has to deal with just federal court and civil liability. And because of a technicality, the officer has been allowed to escape civil liability. And I think American policing agrees that has to change. But at the same time, there is a reason why qualified immunity exists in some form, and we think that there's room there, and we hope that and look to Congress as well as administration to find a way that allows the general principle to be honored, but at the same time the excesses, the abuses of it, to be fixed.
Well, I know we don't have much more time this morning. I have to mention Grechario Mac just because you talk about, training, and this is one of the situations where how are you shooting people in the middle of a mall? That wouldn't happen. That wouldn't happen on a West Side mall. I just don't see that happening without the mall being cleared. That's an example of what I'm talking about. And I know you got to go. We have to go. But I also want to mention you talked about the protests and giving people the space to express their rights and march. And I appreciate that. I think the community does appreciate that. I think what we saw with the Nipsey Hussle I don't know what you tribute in the community. We saw officers taking a different position, standing down and letting people grieve. I did not see that with the George Floyd protests. And, what I saw, and I was one of the marchers, was police taking a very aggressive stance, provoking protesters, using force when they didn't have to. I did not see de-escalation. And, I'm not saying nobody. I'm sure there were plenty of officers that did. I did observe plenty of officers. But I did see a lot of aggression. I saw a lot of provocation, and I saw a lot of escalation. And, it's great to hear you say that you're going to allow people to have their First Amendment rights. But, and I know you're not responsible for the sheriff, but he's saying, well, we're ready to call in the National Guard. And even this idea that we're going to plead with everybody to be peaceful. Can you have the same plea to your staff to be peaceful? Because I feel like it's not just outside agitators. I feel like officers, whether they're having a bad day or, whether they're having a roid rage or whatever's going on with them, they are starting stuff.
So last summer was a very difficult time where it started off with efforts to facilitate, and we tried to facilitate in every instance. Every morning I talked to the command. I spoke with our staff and talked about it being a new day, that when we saw issues escalate where violence against police officers escalated, we had more than 100 officers that were significantly injured, some seriously with fractured skulls, broken legs, lacerations and cuts from projectiles and violence that was expressed by the crowd. And yet that was not representative of the entire crowd. When we look at even the overall protests last summer over a 9-day period, less than 1 in 10 escalated to where there's any violence or looting or riots or damage by anyone in the protest. 9 out of 10 times plus, those protests went with little or other disturbance other than just an expression of a peaceful demonstration. And I believe that the vast majority of our people reacted as they should. Now, we're looking at individual instances, and I have found individual instances where an officer's actions were not warranted, were not justified, and we're taking disciplinary action. We're correcting that. I'm not trying to paint the entire organization without any challenge. And at the same time, I believe the whole entire organization should not be painted on the actions that occur across in other parts of the country or in individual instances where officers' actions were unwarranted. Now, lastly, this issue of de-escalation by the department, we absolutely are talking with our people about resetting, if you will, and they have to look at each instance on its own merit, and they cannot allow that the expressions or actions of a few or individuals within a crowd justify an escalation of force against the entire protest. Our efforts will be to continue to isolate those that are involved in violence and defend ourselves, as well as to hold those individuals accountable, and so that the voices of the crowd can be heard, and also the protection of our people can be maintained. And so that's my commitment. That is something in the aftermath of last year. We have worked extensively with our command, with our people that are on the streets and in the ground, to understand expectations, to understand how to go about and work and facilitate First Amendment rights. And we will be committed as in the days and weeks ahead. It is my hope that the community leaders, yourself and others, can just will encourage crowds and will encourage demonstrators and protesters to be heard and to allow their voices to be heard, and not to allow others within those groups. We know that groups at times will have a hothead or somebody that's there that has no real desire to represent that group's expression, but has their own grievance, their own action, and they intend to use violence. That shouldn't be allowed to stand alongside peaceful protesters, and we don't want that, and we know that most everyone in those protests and demonstrations don't either.
Yes, indeed. Los Angeles Police Department Chief Michel Moore, thank you so much for stopping in. Appreciate the fact that you're always checking in with KJLH.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We will continue in just a moment. Radio Free 102.3 KJLH.